Hello and welcome back guys. Today we are going to start new story, To Be a Father and a Hero, written by Anthony Tyler 9. So let's begin. 200 years ago, before the main events of this story began, a small child in a hospital displayed a strange ability to glow. That child became the first recorded case of a power unique to a single person. Over the years, more children and some adults manifested abilities. As time passed and powers were used, skirmishes became common. On one afternoon, fighting sounded from a small park near the present day. A frightened young boy pleaded with Bakugo, insisting the other could not fight anymore. Bakugo glanced at the boy protecting his quarry and sneered, demanding to know what Deku was doing there. The frightened boy stammered that he had come to stop him, though his legs trembled. Bakugo and his friends then rushed Deku, striking and shoving him in an abrupt, rough attack that left him battered and singed. Deku lay on the ground groaning, staring up at the wide, open sky he loved. Midoriya Izuku thought of his name and of how this marked the beginning of the story of how he would become both a hero and a father at a young age. That memory carried the narrative forward to the present. In the present, Midoriya ran through a futuristic cityscape in a worn black Kakuren. At a train station, he paused to watch a hero defend the area from a towering villain. The crowd identified the hero as Kamui Woods as the hero tried to ensnare the foe with a skill meant to bind him. Before the move could finish, another hero intervened and knocked the villain down. 10-year-old Midoriya recorded the encounter in his notebook, smiled, and then headed toward school, shaking his head at the thought of the day ahead. He felt a chill at the thought of returning to school, knowing he still had 2 years of effort left if he wanted a chance at a prestigious academy like UA. He gathered his courage and walked toward Aldera High School, bracing himself for trouble. Trouble came quickly. On the school grounds, Bakugo Katsuki cornered him and used his explosive quirk to intimidate, scorching the back of Midoriya's uniform and pressing his demps. Bakugo warned him not to apply to UA, insisting that was a school for real heroes, and then dismissed him harshly, ordering him out of sight until class. Midoriya rose, dusted himself off, and went to the bathroom to check his injuries. He found fresh burn marks along his lower back and applied cream and bandages as best he could, thinking quietly that sleeping on his back would be difficult that night. Back in class, the teacher entered with a stack of career planning forms and instructed the students to write down the colleges they wished to apply to, turn the forms in, and then return to the lesson plan for the next few days. When the teacher reached Midoriya's desk and spotted a single red spider lily left there, he scowled at the vandalism and at the student he suspected. The teacher was not kind to Midoriya and often seemed intent on stirring rivalry between the top students. Bakugo and Midoriya were the school's prodigies in academics. Although Bakugo had used his studies to enhance his quirk, Midoriya had kept himself academically ahead. The school adjusted Izuku's points per class so that Bakugo would remain in first place while Izuku was kept in second. When the teacher noticed the red spider lily on Izuku's desk, he looked at the young man who was staring at it. The boy sighed and placed the flower in his backpack before looking back up. The teacher saw how exhausted the 10-year-old appeared, as if he had the weary eyes of someone much older. The teacher left the paper on Izuku's desk and moved on. For the rest of the class, the students worked on their assignments. Izuku finished early and kept to himself until lunch, when he went to the school's roof. On the roof, Izuku took the red spider lily from his backpack and set it in a small gardening pot. He muttered under his breath that he was collecting so many lilies he might as well be a gardener. He arranged the new lily among the others he had gathered since late elementary school, watered the pot, set it near the small greenhouse, and sat down to eat his modest lunch. He ate sparingly. He knew that in the lower levels of the school he might be bullied or have his food taken. The roof felt like a refuge where no one would bother him unless someone really wanted to start trouble. That was when Bakugo burst through the doors, furious. Katsuki reminded Izuku harshly that he had told him not to apply to UA, and insulted him. Izuku instinctively crawled backward and made himself appear as small as possible, stammering that he was only applying for general studies. Katsuki insisted that Izuku would not apply to UA, framing it as an order, and his hands began to crackle with power. Izuku protested that he was not anyone's servant and that you was his dream, that Bakugo could not take it from him. For the first time, he found a bit more courage in his voice. Katsuki lost control of his temper, grabbed Izuku by the collar, and dragged him to the edge of the roof. He hoisted Izuku with one hand so easily that Izuku felt weightless and terrified as he dangled over the drop. Katsuki warned Izuku that if he entered he would not hesitate to let him fall, and taunted that it would relieve others of their worries about him. Izuku glared back and insisted he would not be stopped and that he would get into you. Katsuki's anger intensified and he released his grip. Izuku flailed for a moment and managed to catch the edge of a lower floor windowsill, but his hold slipped. The sudden movement jolted him and he realized his hand was hurt from the strain. As he fell, he saw Katsuki watching from the roof, and he felt panic rise. Just before he hit the ground, someone tackled him out of the air and carried him down to safety. Adrenaline surged through Izuku, and he had made a frightened sound as he fell. The last thing he registered before losing consciousness was a person with light blue hair and purple eyes looking down at him with fear and concern. He then passed out. A young woman walked through the halls of Aldera High School, curious about the boy in Class 1D. He had green hair and green eyes, and what stood out most to her was his gentle kindness toward everyone. She came from a long lineage of villains whose quirks were perfectly suited for villainous work, but she had chosen a different path. She intended to become a hero manager, and the green-haired boy's determination to become a hero had drawn her attention. He analyzed heroes, their costumes, fighting styles, and patrol routes, details that the public was not supposed to know. As she learned what he did each day, she discovered things she had never believed possible. The young man had been harassed and physically assaulted repeatedly at school. Rumors said it had been happening since he was very young. If he had no one to help him during those times of stress and pain, she wanted to be the one to step in. Leaving school that day, she did not expect to hear a cry of fear behind her. Time seemed to slow as she looked up. The boy she had been watching for weeks was falling from the building. Moments before, she had seen a blonde, spiky-haired student at the edge, turning away with a slight smirk. She ran with everything she had and leapt just in time to tackle the boy to the ground, breaking his fall from the upper floors. He instinctively wrapped his arms around her as she landed, and she felt him breathe unevenly. She knelt and checked him, her light blue hair brushing her face. When she moved a few locks of his green hair aside, she noticed 4 freckles on his cheeks, arranged like a small diamond. She felt a brief, surprised warmth at the sight, then forced herself to focus and gently shake him to make sure he was alive. Kori Kazuyuki, she introduced herself aloud as she shook him, asking him to wake up. She then told him not to worry and warned that falling from that height was dangerous. He groaned and pressed a hand to his lower back, wincing. He then stammered his own name and asked who she was and why she had saved him. The boy, Midoriya Izuku, answered with a stammer and introduced himself. He spilled everything to Kori, what had happened, who had pushed him, and how he had been targeted, unaware of how angry she was about the other students' cruelty. She had heard stories about the blonde boy, that he sought out students without quirks and tormented them relentlessly. The idea that someone would single out a student and bully him so harshly made her sick, and she had avoided intervening before because she feared the consequences for the boy if she did. Kori reassured Midoriya that she had only done what anyone should do. He blinked back tears and thanked her, admitting that for a moment he had feared he might not see his mother again. Kori stared at him, taken aback by his vulnerability, and then helped him sit up slowly. She thought, quietly to herself, that she might have a new favorite color. They exchanged names fully as she asked what had led to the fall. Midoriya explained that he had been pushed during another student's attack. Kori felt her resolve harden. She could not ignore this any longer. She supported him as they left the immediate area, making sure he was steady. Midoriya was trembling but grateful, and Kori promised to stay until he felt safe. The blonde student had already walked away, disappearing into the crowd, and Kori made a note to keep a closer watch on both him and the green-haired boy from now on. Kori helped him to his feet and asked what he meant as she steadied him. Izuku explained that his mother had died in an apartment fire a few years ago and that he had lived alone ever since. When Kori asked where he was living now and how he managed to attend school, he admitted that, because he was around 10, the government had placed him in a nearby orphanage. Kori sighed at the answer. Kori then pulled him by the hand and told him to come with her that night to stay with her and her parents. Izuku stammered that he thought he would need to be adopted to join a family. Kori insisted that they were going to be friends and that he would stay with her for the night. Izuku trembled but nodded in agreement. Kori asked what he wanted to be when he grew up. Izuku, still nervous, stuttered that he wanted to be a hero despite being quirkless. Kori thought to herself that he was sincere and that he would have to train his body for that dream, and she was relieved she knew people who could help. They entered Kori's home, removed their shoes, and moved through the small living room to the couch. Kori left briefly for cleaning supplies while Izuku sat and studied the family photographs displayed around the room. He was so absorbed by the images that he did not notice Kori returning with a small medical kit. She sat beside him with the kit in her hands and waited for him to respond. Izuku asked what she needed him to do. Kori said she wanted to make sure he had not been hurt when he fell from the roof, and he took his shirt off so she could check. Kori examined the scars on his chest and abdomen and saw that his hands were swollen. She suspected he had injured his hands when he grabbed a window on the 4th floor and began to wrap bandages around them and his upper torso. Izuku admitted his hands hurt, though not as badly as when he was affected by explosions, and Kori frowned in concern. When she asked about burns on his back, he replied that he had developed a high tolerance for pain over the past 6 years and could cope with a lot. Kori finished the dressings and shook her head sadly, reminding him that no one should have to endure so much pain alone. They sat in a quiet pause. Izuku pulled a notebook from his bag that bore the title Hero Analysis for My Future No. Kori asked how many such notebooks he had made. Izuku said he had 12 others and that they mostly contained observations about heroes and some villains he had seen on the streets. Kori smiled and suggested he write about her quirk. Izuku's eyes lit up, and he asked about the nature of her ability, wondering if it had to do with her hair or eyes and complimenting her appearance and strength when she had carried him earlier. Kori laughed softly at his enthusiasm. Izuku covered his mouth and apologized for rambling. Kori reassured him that he had just startled her and explained that her quirk was ice manipulation. She could shape and control ice found nearby and could even generate it from almost nothing. Izuku, already imagining ways her power could be used to help people, began to sketch ideas in his notebook. Kori admitted that, although helping with rescue efforts appealed to her, she wanted to avoid the life of a hero and would much rather become a teacher at a school that would take her in. She believed she was good with young children. Izuku nodded. They remained on the couch until Izuku's pain became too much and he fell asleep. Left alone with Izuku asleep, Kori worried about how to explain a boy on her family's couch. She paced through the kitchen, rehearsing what she would tell her parents. Her parents arrived just then, smiling as they came in from the front door. Her father was still excited about a recent heist in Mie Prefecture and talked about how their ice quirks had made it possible and how he wanted to bring their daughter into the business. Her mother greeted Kori gently. Kori knew her parents had been pushed into a life of crime by desperate circumstances. They had met, had Kori, and been forced to look after 3 people. She told them there was a guest in the living room. Her mother immediately worried and asked if it was a boy and whether he had hurt Kori. Kori explained that she had saved him from falling off the roof of their school. Her father demanded to know whether the boy had jumped or been pushed. Kori said he had been shoved off the edge by a bully called Kaken and that, from what she had heard at Aldera, his full name was Katsuki Bakugo. The parents walked into the living room and found Izuku sleeping. Kori's mother noticed how malnourished he looked and wondered how he had lasted at that school in such a condition. Kori said he was bullied at school and likely mistreated at the orphanage where he lived. Her father asked which orphanage it was. Kori replied that it was the orphanage for quirkless youth, though she was not sure of its exact location in Mizudafu. Her mother recalled the rumors they had heard growing up about quirkless children being rare and delinquent, but Kori corrected them, saying that from what she had seen he was not a delinquent but a kind person who had been dealt a very hard hand and had not become cynical. Their father looked him over more closely and noted serious injuries to his hands, insisting that Izuku needed medical attention. Izuku woke at that and panicked at the idea of going to a hospital, curling into a corner of the couch. Kori rushed to his side and put her hands on his arms, his eyes darted around before settling on Kori's light blue eyes, and he began to calm. Kori guided him to breathe slowly and steadily until the panic eased. A heavy silence settled as the parents took in how thin he was. Kori's mother insisted that they needed to get him medical care, proper food, and exercise, though she admitted they were already stretched thin caring for the three of them. Her father continued to study Izuku with growing concern. Kori's father said he could skip some meals so Izuku could eat, and that they needed to make sure Midoriya was safe and would soon become part of their family. He asked whether Izuku knew who his parents were. Izuku stammered that his mother was Inko Midoriya and that she had died a few years before. He said he did not know where his father was and that all he had was what his mother had told him. He looked anxious and breathless. Kori's father asked again if Izuku knew exactly where his father might be. Izuku replied that he believed his father was in the United States because his mother had mentioned his job there. Kori asked if Izuku could get in contact with his father, and Izuku shook his head. Izuku explained that his father had left after learning about his Quirkless diagnosis and had fought with his mother before he left. Kori's father grew very sad. Liz asked if Izuku had been hurt when his father left. Izuku turned slightly and showed a scar from an old burn, and said his father had not wanted a quirkless son, he had wanted a son who matched a mixture of his and his mother's quirks. The three adults sighed in frustration. A few days after that conversation, the Kazuyuki family adopted Izuku. Izuku began to develop strong feelings for Kori, but the adults decided not to discuss how his adoption might affect their relationship as they built their family life. During those days Izuku stayed close to Kori to avoid running into Katsuki at school. When Kori could not reach him, he was targeted regularly in rough schoolyard scuffles. Bakugo made it clear that he would not let anything stand in the way of becoming a hero from Aldera and tried to remove Izuku from the picture. Bakugo also reacted negatively when he saw Izuku spending time with a girl from another class, but Izuku defended her and the girl defended him. As a result, their peers intensified the harassment aimed at separating them. The harassment included aggressive confrontations, and Kori often had to deal with taunts and pushes in each class she entered. Unlike Izuku, she sometimes fought back, confronting her bullies in return. Over the next year and a half, the two, ostracized by their classmates, formed a bond of trust and mutual protection. That bond motivated Izuku to train his body, determined to become stronger so he could defend himself and protect Kori. Kori was glad to see his growing confidence, though she noticed he remained humble when given compliments. By their second year of junior high the two realized their feelings had deepened into a close, caring relationship. One afternoon on the school roof where they could eat in peace, Izuku told Kori how much he cared for her. They paused, feeling awkward for a moment. Izuku immediately apologized that he had not meant to cause any awkwardness, and Kori giggled slightly. Kori asked whether he had meant what he had said. Izuku, stunned for a moment, explained that she was the only person who had made an effort to help him in his life, that no one else had done that before, and that she was kind and caring and helped him when he had injuries. He admitted that he often thought about her. Kori thanked him and told him he had helped her as well, reminding him of how their peers treated them both at school. Izuku looked at her, listening intently. He had heard of trauma bonding before, but the simple fact that it had been about a year since he was introduced to her made him feel like things were moving too fast. He did not deny that he did not want to be with her either, she was literally the only one who showed she did not care about his quirklessness. They were cleaning the beach at Takoba Municipal Beach Park to help him build muscle. If he wanted to join UA University in a year and a half, he would need to increase his workload to prepare for the demanding entrance exams. They walked away from the school together, thinking about the future. Izuku was staying with Kori's family for a while longer because he would need to find a job soon to support himself. The best part was that Cory's parents, Crozel and Liz, planned to leave their criminal life and retire. Izuku entered the Kazuyuki household and removed his shoes as Cory followed him toward her bedroom. Cory's parents trusted Izuku not to harm her, even if they had not expected him to date their daughter. At dinner, the two young people made it clear to Crozel and Liz that they intended to become a couple, much to Liz's happiness. Several months into the term, while Cory's parents were away, the two shared a private moment. There were no lasting consequences. They were discovered the next morning, which led to embarrassment but ultimately brought them closer. Both were relieved that nothing irreversible had happened, and they remained close over the following months. Izuku found a small-time job at a nearby convenience store, which was a cause for quiet celebration. The two managed to graduate from Aldera Junior High and applied to the only high school that would accept Izuku, since it was the best in the district. It was no secret around Aldera that Izuku was quirkless, and many students at Aldera High School treated him poorly. Cory stayed by his side through the bullying. One afternoon, as Izuku opened his backpack on the school grounds, Cory asked what trouble the students had caused this time. Inside the bag were at least 20 red spider lilies, and Cory let out a sigh of exasperation before leading Izuku up to the building's rooftop for lunch. Cory's parents had quit their criminal life in order to find steady jobs and provide for the two teenagers through high school. Izuku still wanted to get into UA University and become a pro-hero despite being quirkless, and he trained hard. Learning martial arts from online resources had been difficult, but he taught himself the forms and became competent on paper. He simply lacked a sparring partner to test his skills. He still harbored a lingering fear of Katsuki, who had once attacked him in the past. That kind of trauma did not fade easily. The two sat in silence on the rooftop and ate their lunch, enjoying the serene calm of the day, though both sensed that the quiet would not last. Izuku asked what Cory wanted to become after they finished high school while he ate a small sandwich. Cory said she believed she should become his manager, a heroics manager, so she could spend as much time as possible with him, and the two chuckled. Izuku muttered that she must not let him down because he still needed to design a hero costume to wear on the streets and pulled out a notebook. Cory listened as Izuku quietly went over the support items he would need as a quirkless hero until lunch ended. They returned to class to continue their lessons, and Izuku showed clear signs of improving mentally. Katsuki, who shared the classroom, grew irritated at Izuku's soft muttering about the lesson. He allowed Izuku to continue because he believed he knew how to keep him under his control. He had already called him out for being quirkless at the start of school and assumed it was only a matter of time before Cory left him. When the day ended, Izuku packed his things to leave. Katsuki decided to follow with a couple of others to show Izuku his place and to ensure he did not do anything rash. Izuku and Cory walked out of the school grounds holding hands. Izuku felt uneasy and looked to Cory to make sure she shared that feeling. Cory asked if he wanted her to disappear, and Izuku nodded. She climbed into a nearby tree and hid from view. Izuku turned, pulled out a scrapbook he kept for when Katsuki bothered him, and headed toward the school exit. Near the exit, Katsuki and his companions waited. Katsuki demanded to know where Izuku's girlfriend was, implying she had been with him earlier. Izuku responded with a guarded glare, and the months he had spent with Cory had strengthened his confidence so he could speak without stammering. Katsuki said he had intended to show them both their place but that he could take it out on Izuku alone, warning that if he found her again there would be consequences. He then activated his quirk. Izuku flinched briefly, a reflex from past trauma, but then relaxed and assumed a calm defensive stance. Katsuki smirked, believing Izuku had been practicing self-defense and that it would not be enough. He imagined that if Cory watched her boyfriend get beaten she might leave him for Katsuki, then launched his attack. Katsuki threw a wild explosive right hook. Izuku ducked under the blow, felt heat sweep past his back, and grabbed Katsuki's arm as smoke and debris swirled. Using the momentum, Izuku flipped Katsuki into the air and leapt up to deliver a kick that sent him to the ground. Katsuki lay winded and disoriented while Izuku stood over him, calm and focused. Izuku told Katsuki that if he wanted to continue, he should learn how to fight without relying on his quirk, because only then might he be able to survive as a hero. As Izuku began to walk away, Katsuki rose and charged, pulling his right arm back and ordering his lackeys to hold Izuku down in order to teach him a lesson. Izuku turned and was caught by a burst of explosive energy, staggered, and the scene erupted into chaotic motion. As he skidded across the ground, Izuku felt his arms grabbed from both sides and looked left and right to find Katsuki's lackeys holding him. Izuku mocked that resorting to having the two hold him down was not very heroic. Katsuki snarled and unleashed a barrage of explosive punches at Izuku's chest and arms, trying to prove he was the superior fighter. The scene played out like an intense anime confrontation. Flashes of energy and smoke filled the air while Izuku stood his ground, refusing to give Katsuki the satisfaction of a sound. When the smoke finally cleared, Katsuki saw Izuku held by the others, glaring but visibly battered, his uniform torn and singed. Katsuki ordered his lackeys to release him, then had them deliver a few more kicks before leaving. Izuku did not cry out. About 15 minutes after the confrontation, Kori arrived and checked Izuku over. Kori told Izuku she could not believe Katsuki still wanted to take her away and that it would not happen, especially with the information Izuku had given her about Katsuki's weaknesses. Izuku, weak and steady, suggested they go home since it had been a long day, and Kori agreed. From that day on they decided to walk together more often and to separate whenever Izuku sensed danger. That pattern continued for 2 years. A few months before graduation, Kori received startling medical test results that left her shaken. She quietly left the bathroom and walked over to where Izuku was training in the living room. Seeing her tearful face, Izuku rushed to her, deeply worried. Kori wiped her eyes and showed him the results. Izuku struggled to process what it meant. Kori asked what they should do. Izuku, concerned about her safety and knowing Katsuki was searching for her more aggressively, insisted that Kori finish high school at home and avoid returning to school until it was safe. Kori said the condition had been developing for months. The two exchanged exasperated looks and decided to tell Kori's parents, Liz and Kosher, and ask for their help. With Kori's parents' approval to assist, the couple prepared for what was to come. Months later, after training and clearing Dagoba Municipal Beach, Izuku heard an ambulance near his home and ran toward it when he heard paramedics speaking about a woman needing urgent care. Izuku called out for Kori and identified himself to a paramedic as the person with her. The paramedic said they needed to get the woman to the hospital. After Kori confirmed Izuku was telling the truth, the paramedic allowed him to get into the ambulance with them. The trip to Mizurufu General Hospital was short and bumpy as Kori screamed in pain and Izuku gripped her hand, reassuring her that they were almost there. Paramedics and Izuku brought Kori into the hospital, and the doctors asked Izuku to wait outside so they could attend to her. While he waited, Izuku called Kori's parents to tell them their grandchild had been born. They said they would be there within minutes. They had been able to leave work early from nearby convenience stores and arrived shortly after. The doctor called for Kori's parents, and Izuku and her parents stood and followed him down the corridor. The doctor led them into the recovery room, where they found Kori holding and feeding the newborn. Izuku moved beside her and placed his hand over hers. Kori smiled and asked if he wanted to meet their son. The baby had no hair yet, so it was impossible to tell which parent's coloring he would inherit. When the infant opened his eyes, Izuku was captivated by the striking mismatched irises, one teal and one light blue with flecks of emerald. Izuku asked what she wanted to name him, and when he offered his finger the newborn gripped it firmly. Kori smiled and said she had been thinking of the name Hyoriku, a blend of their colors. Izuku thought the name was appealing and hugged Kori gently while they made sure the baby was comfortable. A few days later, Kori was able to return home with the baby after her parents helped cover the hospital bill. Kori's parents stayed to teach the couple how to care for Hyoriku, since Izuku and Kori were still adjusting to parenthood. Izuku decided to step back from in-person school to help raise their child, completing his remaining coursework online within 2 weeks so he could be more present. Months passed and the new family took a quiet afternoon walk through a park in Mizurufu. They sat on a bench and watched Hyoriku take in the world around him, his eyes bright with curiosity. The peaceful moment was broken by a sudden popping sound nearby. Instinctively, Izuku stood, shielding Kori and Hyoriko and deflecting an errant attack with a swift, non-lethal maneuver reminiscent of an exaggerated anime-style dodge. Katsuki appeared and confronted Izuku with a furious outburst, demanding to know where he had been. Hyoriko cried out in fear from the sudden commotion, and Izuku noticed a small, superficial burn on the child's hand. The minor injury was not serious, but it ignited Izuku's protective instincts. He turned on Katsuki with a furious expression and asked what had happened. Katsuki accused Izuku of disappearing from Aldera, questioning whether Izuku thought he could simply escape. Izuku pleaded for peace and demanded to be allowed to live his life without interference, angrily accusing Katsuki of hurting his child. Katsuki, taken aback, denied knowing Izuku had a child. Izuku warned Katsuki as calmly as he could that Katsuki had burned his son's hand and that if he did not leave now, Izuku would not be able to hold himself back. Katsuki exploded, refusing to be told what to do, and threw a right hook. Izuku grabbed Katsuki's hand, twisted it, then struck him and kicked him away. He heard Kori scream as members of Katsuki's group moved to take the stroller, one of them restraining Kori. One attacker produced a knife and aimed it at Hyoriko, and Izuku froze. The boy sneered and told Izuku to stay still, taunting that he would not want anything to happen to his child. Izuku stared at the attacker, momentarily forgetting Katsuki standing up behind him. Kori lunged to protect the child, pulling at the attacker's arm. The attacker jerked away and struck her, she collapsed. In the scramble, Katsuki landed a hard blow to Izuku's back and sent him to the ground. Izuku tried to rise. The attacker held the knife and gestured toward the stroller. Someone nearby cursed about the group's ruined plans, but the words dimmed as Izuku watched Kori slump, color draining from her face. His son's cries grew louder. Feeling a sharp pain in his left arm, Izuku forced himself up and slammed into Katsuki, driving him off balance. Izuku moved toward the attacker with the knife, eyes narrowed. He struck the man hard, pushing him away from the stroller and sending him further off. He did not notice heroes approaching. Izuku pulled his son from the stroller and sat on the ground beside Kori's still form, managing a small, tearful smile. Katsuki used the confusion to slip away. Izuku spotted the discarded knife on the ground nearby. Darkness began to creep in at the edges of his vision as he clutched his crying son to his chest, tears streaming. A relatively new hero knelt beside him and assured him that they would get him and the child to safety and pursue those responsible. Izuku lost consciousness. When Izuku woke, Kori's parents stood over him, their faces etched with worry. Liz sobbed openly, and Kosher urged Izuku to rest, gently but firmly pushing him back down when he tried to sit up. Izuku asked hoarsely where Kori was. Liz could only wail and left the room. Kosher, eyes glistening, hugged Izuku and explained that Kori had been killed 2 days earlier at Muzutafu Municipal Park. She had been fatally wounded during the attack and had died instantly. The revelation brought fresh torrents of tears. Despite medication and pain, Izuku forced himself up, insisting he had to get to his son. Kosher and the medical staff tried to keep him down, but Izuku stumbled toward the door. As he reached it, the doctor opened it and immediately tried to guide him back onto the bed. The doctor hurried into the room and warned that Izuku should not be out of bed. His arm had been amputated and he had lost a great deal of blood, so he was not ready to be walking around. Nurses moved in to restrain him. Izuku struggled and insisted that he needed to get to his son. Adrenaline gave him sudden strength and he pushed the nurses aside as he rushed from the room searching the hospital. A doctor administered a sedative dart to his back and Izuku immediately began to feel woozy. He managed to whisper that he had to get to Hyoriko before collapsing to his knees and losing consciousness. Tears streamed down his face as his vision closed and more staff ran down the hall. To be a father and a hero, Izuku woke up on the hospital bed groaning as he stared at the white ceiling and remembered where he was. He reached to get up and tried to stand but felt something holding him back. Turning his head, he found a pair of HNDCFFs securing him to the bed. He demanded to know why he was handcuffed and repeated that he needed to get to Hyoriko, writhing against the restraints. The rapid rise in his heart rate drew doctors and nurses into the room. The doctor urged him to calm down and promised that his son was all right and would be brought to him, but that he needed to answer a police officer's questions. Izuku glared and insisted that he wanted his son brought to him immediately. When a faint creak came from the cuffs, the nurses left the room to fetch the child. A police officer entered with a neutral expression and asked Izuku to recount what had happened 3 days earlier at Mizudafu Municipal Park. As Izuku began to answer, the door opened and Hyoraku was carried in asleep. The officer and a nurse placed the baby into Izuku's arms, and Izuku instinctively held the child close as the baby curled into his embrace. Izuku explained that he had been walking to the park with his girlfriend and his newborn son, only a few months old, when they were attacked by Katsuki Bakugo and a couple of other boys. Izuku described how Katsuki had bullied him since childhood after his quirkless diagnosis, and how the other boys had threatened to harm Hyoraku if Izuku did not allow Katsuki to attack him. The police officer's expression hardened at the mention of Izuku's quirkless status. The officer accused Izuku of fabricating the story. Izuku said that he did not care whether the officer believed him and that his only wish was to be left alone to raise his son in peace. The officer took the baby from him and ordered that the child be taken to the orphanage. Izuku protested that he had not lied and objected to being discriminated against because he was quirkless. The officer's hand moved toward his gun. The doctor intervened, ensuring the child would be cared for and not sent to the orphanage immediately. The officer then pulled Izuku from the bed and told him to get dressed. Izuku was informed that he was now part of a homicide case involving Kori Kazuyuki. A few hours later Izuku found himself sitting in the defendant's booth as the officer who had questioned him served as prosecutor. He answered the questions with nothing but the truth, but witness accounts placed him at the center of the killing of Kori. Izuku knew who the real perpetrators were, and the gap between the truth and the official story widened as the hearing continued. The court case ended as quickly as it had begun. Izuku was ordered to juvenile detention until the end of the year. As officers led him away and placed him in a police van, he replayed everything that had led him to this point. He wondered if things could possibly get worse. He felt like he was tempting fate, but that did not change the facts. The woman he loved had been killed, and the blame had been shifted onto him because he was quirkless. He had been born without a quirk, denied the chance to make friends because of Katsuki's bullying, and now his son would grow up without understanding why his father had disappeared. When Izuku arrived at the juvenile facility near Tartarus, he was confined to a cell and left to wait. His one chance to become a hero had been taken from him by people who refused to admit responsibility for the destruction of his life. As the days stretched on and his place in Hyoraku's life slipped farther away, Izuku pushed himself physically to keep some hold on purpose. He received food from the warden from time to time, but he suspected it was as much an attempt to provoke him as anything else. He had been wrongfully accused, and he refused to give them the reaction they wanted. He planned instead to do everything he could to shorten his sentence and leave to find his son. Over the next few months he trained relentlessly and kept his distance from the other inmates, many of whom had violent histories. When they asked about his crime, he kept quiet and avoided them. He knew they were looking for a reason to target new BLD. In September, a trio of inmates with smug expressions pushed into his cell. One of them taunted him, saying that word had come around that he was the new quirkless inmate and jeering at quirkless people. He followed with an insulting demand that Izuku prove his SBMSN by praising him and his authority over the other boys. Izuku refused to comply. He vowed that he would not bow to anyone in that place and that he would get out, find his son, and raise him right. Anger and grief over his girlfriend's death, the separation from his son, and years of abuse and trauma surged through him, and the two larger inmates lunged. Izuku was no longer helpless. In a burst of fast, athletic movement he dodged their strikes and sent them crashing to the floor. The middle boy reacted with fury, drawing a small weapon and charging. Izuku moved quickly to disarm and deflect the attack. The assailant was struck and sent tumbling out of the cell. In the scuffle Izuku felt a sharp graze along his side. He did not react theatrically, instead he used STRP of his shirt to press against the wound and steady himself. The guards separated the 3 inmates and hauled them back to their cells. Izuku demanded to be left alone, insisting he did not want any further trouble that could be pinned on him. He closed the cell door and sat on the bunk, breathing steadily as the adrenaline faded and he tended to his injury. A few days later, 2 men stood outside the juvenile detention center. One of them, a black-haired man, asked Inspector Tsukachi why they were there. Tsukachi explained that the boy's case had suggested he might have been wrongfully accused, and that they were there to investigate and determine whether someone else was responsible. With that, the 2 entered the facility. The warden asked what had brought the lie detector and Eraserhead to the center as Tsukachi smiled. Tsukachi explained that they had reason to believe one of the tenants had been wrongfully accused of murder. The warden replied that he did not want to presume they were wrong and asked who the tenant was. Tsukachi identified Midoriya Izuku and said that, according to the file, Izuku had been labeled a delinquent. Tsukachi believed those records had been fabricated to protect the real people involved in Kori Kazuyuki's murder. He did not mention what else he had learned about the Kazuyuki family. The warden expressed disbelief that Midoriya Izuku, the quirkless boy, could not be the killer. Tsukachi insisted he believed Izuku was innocent and had cause to think that if Izuku told his side of the story, they could find the true killer. Tsukachi noted that Izuku had been present when his girlfriend had been killed, which made the case urgent. When they arrived at the cell, Eraserhead examined the young man sitting on the bed. The boy had green hair down to his neck and freckles on his cheeks in a diamond pattern. His green eyes were dull as he waited, and Eraserhead noticed a stain on the front of his clothing indicating a recent wound. Eraserhead asked why the boy was still bleeding. The warden explained that the inmate had started a fight earlier that day and had been left to suffer as a minor punishment. They opened the cell and brought the young man out. He was subdued and compliant as they moved him. They put him in a police car and drove to the station to record his statement for the cold case. A few hours later, Recovery Girl had healed him enough for questioning. Tsukachi began to introduce himself, and Izuku interrupted by giving Tsukachi's full name and stating that he had tried to have Tsukachi assigned to his case but had been denied a fair trial because he was quirkless. Tsukachi asked how Izuku knew his name, and Izuku, with tears in his eyes, said that what he had gone through had been a long series of mental, physical, and emotional abuses. Tsukachi started the recorder. Izuku's eyes shone with tears as he told his story of growing up quirkless in a school that had treated quirkless students poorly. He recounted meeting the Kazuyuki family, how Kori had saved him from an attack by Katsuki Bakugo, and how Kori and he had grown close and later had a son together. Izuku then described how his girlfriend had been killed by one of Bakugo's friends, who had used a knife. He said the police had not processed the weapon for fingerprints. Izuku said he had been there when Kori was fatally wounded and had watched her collapse. He insisted that he had been framed for Kori Kazuyuki's murder. Tsukachi told Izuku that everything he had said sounded consistent and asked if he knew who had killed Kori. Izuku said he could not remember the man's name, but he could not get the man's face out of his head. He described the man as a young man about Izuku's age with long black hair, a slightly larger midsection, a long nose, and sharp, angular eyes. Izuku explained that the man's quirk allowed him to extend his fingers to sharp points and that the man had been bullying him since early childhood. Izuku then recalled the name Yubi Yuto. Tsukachi asked Izuku to describe what had happened the day Kori died. Izuku said he had been walking with Kori in Mizutafu Municipal Park. They had wanted their son Hyoriko to enjoy the peaceful air and make a good memory at the park. He could not remember many details of the time, and he began to cry, saying that what was meant to be a happy outing had become a nightmare. Eraserhead noticed that Izuku was missing an arm and asked what had happened. Izuku explained that Katsuki Bakugo, who had an explosive quirk and had hated him since childhood, had once used that quirk in a way that resulted in the loss of his arm. Izuku stared at the 2 men with tears in his eyes, and then asked what had happened to Hyoriko. The officers showed him photographs of his son with a new family, and Izuku recognized the Bakugo family as soon as he saw Katsuki in one of the images. Izuku told them that his son had been given to the Bakugos. Detective Tsukachi asked whether Masaru and Mitsuki Bakugo were good parents, and Izuku confirmed that they were, but added that Katsuki was different. Izuku said that Katsuki had been driven by ego from a young age and that, while he could not stop him, he intended to make Katsuki pay for what he had done. Eraserhead advised against a vengeful course of action, warning that two wrongs would not make things right. Izuku responded with anger, describing a lifetime of suffering, having to endure destructive blasts from a dangerous quirk for most of his life, being thrown from a high building by someone he had once trusted, and losing his girlfriend to a violent attack in front of him. Izuku demanded retribution for Katsuki and his friends for what they had done 8 months earlier. Detective Tsukachi reminded Izuku that they were there to help clear his name in the framed court case and that they would work to reveal the full consequences of Katsuki's actions. He asked Izuku to consider whether vengeance was truly what he wanted. The court case concluded quickly and in Izuku's favor after the real culprit was identified. That person had committed another violent crime and their attempt to pin the murder on Izuku during the trial became evident. Later that evening, Izuku arrived at the Bakugo residence while the police and Eraserhead stayed nearby. Mitsuki opened the door and saw a one-armed Izuku standing there with a sad but relieved expression. Mitsuki reacted with surprise at his missing arm, and Izuku glanced past her to see Katsuki glaring at him. Izuku told Mitsuki to let Katsuki explain what he had done. Mitsuki stiffened and turned to face her son. Katsuki stared at Izuku in disbelief. Izuku then revealed the scars and injuries he bore, making clear what Katsuki had done to him, and accused him of harming his body and attempting to take his child. Katsuki approached calmly, and the two faced each other for a moment. Katsuki handed the child to his mother and then pulled Izuku outside into the front yard. Katsuki demanded to know why Izuku was there and remarked that he had assumed Izuku was still in juvenile detention for Kori's death. Izuku insisted that it had not been him who killed her but Yubi Yuto, and that Yuto's fingerprints had been found on the knife, and Katsuki reacted with a low growl. Katsuki denied the accusation and maintained that Yubi could not be a killer. Izuku told him that Yubi had been caught earlier that morning in connection with the killing of another person's partner, and Katsuki's eyes widened. Katsuki mocked Izuku, taunting that Izuku could not take his son back because the child was a Bakugo now. Izuku replied that Katsuki would not be getting his hero license anytime soon, which left Katsuki confused. Izuku made a hand signal, and Detective Tsukachi announced that Katsuki Bakugo was under arrest for discrimination against a quirkless individual, attempted murder, and aiding and abetting murder. Katsuki protested that he had no part in it, but Tsukachi explained that his lie detection quirk had shown he was lying. Tsukachi said they were placing Katsuki in juvenile detention and that the child would be placed in Izuku's care pending rehabilitation. Eraserhead then activated his quirk and forced Katsuki into the police car. Izuku walked to the Bakugo household door and knocked. Mitsuki Bakugo answered, asking after Izuku and where Katsuki was, and Izuku felt a heavy sadness as he prepared to explain. Izuku told Mitsuki and Masaru everything about his relationship with Katsuki over the last 10 years and about Katsuki's actions leading up to that moment. As he spoke, the Bakugo parents clutched Hyoriku in their arms and wept. They had been unaware of the depths of their son's arrogance and the violent choices he had made until now. Izuku reassured them that Katsuki would be out eventually and would have to answer for what he had done, and when they asked what he meant, Izuku said that he believed revenge was best served cold. He apologized for frightening them, admitting that 10 years of fury, hatred, and recent grief had taken their toll. The parents, guided by the detective's arrangements, handed Hyoriku to Izuku. The infant opened his eyes, smiled, and began to babble happily when Izuku brought his hand to the child's face. Izuku accepted temporary guardianship and settled into a new routine. It had been less than a week since Izuku had been released from the juvenile detention cell. He had used his time there and the days immediately after to train hard, keeping to weight routines and martial arts in the basement of the Bakugo home. The Bakugo family had been devastated to learn that their son had urged Izuku to harm himself shortly before his arrest, and because Izuku had been blamed for the death of his girlfriend Kori, he had lost much of his trust in law enforcement. While the Bakugo parents cared for Hyoriko since the baby was more than Izuku could manage alone, Izuku retreated to the basement to work through his emotions. He was often found striking a heavy bag with intense focus, haunted by the memory of discovering Kori and by the voices of those who had blamed him. Holding Hyoriko had become both a comfort and a reminder of what he had lost. During one session, after slamming his fist into the bag as hard as he could, Izuku felt a sharp twinge in his wrist. He rubbed the spot to soothe the pain and looked up to see that the punching bag had slipped from its chain and fallen to the floor. Izuku sighed and sat on the ground. He pulled a picture of Kori and her family from his pocket and stared at it until his eyes began to well. Tears fell onto the photograph where Kori stood beside him smiling. Each drop blurred her face slightly, and Izuku sank to his knees with a gutting sob, pressing a hand to his chest as if to hold the ache inside. Masaru came down into the basement a short time later and found Izuku kneeling and crying. The older man paused, then stepped forward hesitantly and pulled the boy into a hug. Masaru told him that a young man should not have to carry so much pain alone and asked Izuku to reach out to him and Mitsuki if it happened again, assuring him that they understood. Izuku clung to Masaru, crying and begging silently for it all to be nothing but a bad dream he would wake from. Later that day, Izuku returned to the park where he had lost Kori and moved quickly toward the beach. He carried Hyoriko in his arms while Masaru and Mitsuki trailed behind, giving him space. He had been focusing more intensely on training for UA, determined to become a hero for both himself and Kori. At the beach, Izuku surveyed the scattered trash while Hyoriko fussed in his arms. He breathed out and began to sort through the debris, examining items as he went. As he worked, he came upon a young woman around his age with pink hair styled in dreadlocks, laughing loudly with energizing, wild enthusiasm. Izuku asked if she was all right, and the woman turned to face him. She demanded to know who he was, then studied him with eyes that had a searching, intense quality. Izuku found himself fascinated by those eyes and instinctively took out a notebook, making notes about what her quirk might be. The woman watched him as he muttered, then focused instead on the baby in his arms and asked whose child it was. Izuku explained that the baby, Hyoriko, was his son. The woman asked what had brought him to what she called her home. Izuku apologized, explaining that he had come to clean the beach as part of his training to get into UA and that he would leave if his work would disturb her space. She laughed it off and said that this place was not her real home. She came here as a secondary spot and enjoyed creating many things there. When Izuku asked her name, she introduced herself as Hatsum Mei and claimed she would one day be the head of Hatsum Industries. She asked who he was, and Izuku gave his name and described himself as an aspiring Quirkless hero. Mei brightened and offered enthusiastic support, saying she could not wait to provide the gear he would need and imagining the devices she could craft to protect him. She shook with excitement as she sat on a piece of wreckage nearby. Izuku hesitated at her earlier talk of babies, and Mei clarified that she called her inventions her babies. She admitted that her mother had warned her to be more careful about how she spoke, but that she could not help her fondness for her creations. Izuku laughed softly at her earnestness and expressed hope that they might work together someday. He extended a hand in a friendly gesture, and Mei responded warmly, using his family name. She urged him to get back to his cleaning so she could return to her work. Izuku gathered himself and Hyoriko and walked back toward Masaru and Mitsuki so they could see him. Mitsuki asked where Izuku had gone and what was happening back there. Izuku explained that there had been a girl on the beach making inventions out of the trash and that he hoped she would get into the school she wanted. He handed Hyoriko to Mitsuki. Izuku said it was time to start cleaning the beach, then began moving the smaller but heavier items from the trash piles. Over the next few months Izuku kept at cleaning the beach and provided supplies for fixing parts and other projects that Hatsum had requested. Their relationship became friendly. They spent time together while Mitsuki and Masaru watched Hyoriko so Izuku could be with others his age. The two moved on to different beaches, collecting parts and pieces of broken devices and rebuilding items together. Mei noted that Izuku was very good at building and asked why he did not want to become a support hero like her. Izuku explained that he had wanted to be a hero since he was 4. Even after being diagnosed as quirkless, it remained the one thing he had ever wanted, no matter the cost. Now that he was a father, his time was split between Hyoriko and his life as a hero, and he hoped he was managing as a single parent. He muttered the last part quietly. Mei said she believed he was doing the best he could and, bluntly, that having a child at that point in his life had been unwise. Izuku responded with a playful glare. He admitted that he had been young and naive at the time. Izuku added that Kori had told him it was a safe day and that he had not realized she had lied until it was too late. Mei laughed and suggested that Kori had wanted to surprise him. Izuku asked what Mei intended to do with the broken devices as they entered her family's garage. Mei explained that they were for her latest project, a jetpack inspired by air jet for flight. Izuku clarified that she was making a replica, and Mei said it would not be exactly the same because it would house small robotic AIs that could help her hack into mainframes quickly. Izuku chuckled. He reminded Mei to eat and sleep and mentioned that she had a test at school. Mei waved him off and muttered that the others did not deserve her. Izuku left the house and was met by Mr. Hatsum outside, who smiled with relief. Mr. Hatsum thanked Izuku for being his daughter's only friend and explained that she had not gotten out much since her little sister had been diagnosed with cancer. Izuku said it was his pleasure, noting that he had lost someone himself and that Mei had become an anchor in his life. Mr. Hatsum offered his blessing if Izuku wanted to be with his daughter and teased about Mei's habit of calling her projects babies. Izuku blushed and muttered that he did not want to sully Kori's name before walking away. When Izuku returned to the Bakugo residence, he found Katsuki standing in the doorway. Katsuki told Izuku that, because of him, he could not go to UA anymore, but that he also knew he had been wrong. He said he would not take back what he had done, but that did not mean he would remain friends. Katsuki explained that he was on parole and would be attending Ketsubatsu University, which offered a reformation program for people like him, and warned Izuku not to allow himself to die like Tatargane had. Katsuki gathered his belongings. Izuku asked where Katsuki was going as Katsuki glared at him. Katsuki told Izuku that he was heading to Ketsubatsu to take their villain reformation program and ordered Izuku to leave him alone and never speak to him again, then left, leaving Izuku standing at the door. Izuku muttered that at least Katsuki would not be bothering him anymore before entering the home. Mitsuki and Masaru stood in the doorway and gave Izuku a gentle glare. They apologized for their earlier looks, explaining that Katsuki was still their son and that they wished he would not be so rude. Izuku said he was not hungry and would go to bed, and Mitsuki nodded. Carrying his sleeping child, Izuku climbed the stairs to find that Katsuki's old room had been converted for Hyoriko. Izuku placed the baby in the small crib and turned on the baby camera. He sat on the bed beside the crib and lay down, resting an arm inside the playpen where Hyoriko slept. Izuku fell asleep and did not notice the small hand that reached for his finger. Mitsuki and Masaru opened the door quietly, smiled at the tender sight, and took a picture to remember the moment. Later, Izuku stood on the last scattered pieces of trash at Dagoba Municipal Beach Park and smiled at the sight of the beach finally clean for the first time since his mother had taken him there as a child. While he stood on the small heap, an older man walked up beside him on the sand and took in the view with a calm smile. Izuku looked down at the man, then pulled his shirt over his chest and arm before sliding down the pile. The man looked eerily like All Might would if he had lost all of his bulk. Izuku studied the man's thin frame, long bangs falling over a sunken face, clothes hanging loosely, a large white shirt draped over his shoulders, green pants with a small hole at the knee, and oversized brown shoes that somehow fit. The man cleared his throat in a gravelly voice and remarked that it was rude to stare for so long. Izuku apologized and explained that he had been struck by how much the man resembled someone he admired. The man asked who Izuku looked up to. Izuku answered that the person was known around the world as All Might, the only male figure he had looked up to. He added that he had no father and had lost his mother when he was young. They were quiet for a time before the man asked who took care of Izuku now. Izuku said that the Bakugo family, close friends of his mother, had helped, and that he himself had to care for his son Hyoriko because his girlfriend had passed away. Tears welled in his eyes as he spoke. The man expressed sympathy and asked the name of the woman Izuku had lost. Izuku replied that her name was Kazuyuki Kori, the first girl he had fallen in love with and the one who had saved his life in middle school. The man said he had lost someone important as well, though his loss had come much earlier. When Izuku asked for the name, the man smiled and explained that his mentor had been Shimura Nana, better known as Pro-Hero Nimbus. The man said that she had taught him to always smile, no matter the situation. Izuku chuckled and reflected that she sounded like someone he would have loved as a mentor, someone whose advice he could have used through most of his school life. The older man expressed confidence that whatever Izuku's dreams were, he could attain them. Izuku asked the man's name, and the man introduced himself as Yagi Toshinori, expressing a sincere hope to see Izuku grow as a person before walking away. After showering, Izuku fed his son, Hyoriku, breakfast and left him in the care of Mitsuki Bakugo. Mitsuki smiled as he departed, and Izuku made his way toward UA, thinking over everything in his life up to that point. He had fallen in love with someone who had liked him for who he was despite his quirkless status. After her death he had made a new friend, and before she died they had had a child whom he was now raising alone. Now he had to prepare for the biggest test of his life. He looked at his phone's cracked screen, where a photo of his late girlfriend appeared. Her family had moved away from Mizutafu and contact had ceased. He shook his head and walked toward the large H building where students trained to become the best heroes they could be. Inside a small room on the right, Izuku began the written exam and focused on the ultimate test. He understood there were different types of heroes, and he believed he would be a Type 2 hero, someone who relied on intelligence gathering and smarter tactics rather than brute force. He spent nearly 2 hours in the testing room and emerged mentally exhausted. He had not expected the written portion to be so difficult, but he felt he had passed. The question that had tripped him up asked why heroism had become a profession in the age of quirks and superheroes and how it had come to be. He had been out of school for that portion of the curriculum and had been stumped. He sat alone in the auditorium and decided to rest before the proctor arrived. After about 50 minutes he was nudged awake by someone. A young girl with short brown hair, a permanent blush to her cheeks, and calm chocolate-brown eyes looked at him with concern. She asked if he was all right and mentioned that Present Mike was about to begin the practical portion information session. Izuku mumbled that his son had kept him up all night and wiped his eyes. The girl apologized for waking him and spoke quietly that she had not realized he was catching up on sleep. Izuku said he needed to be awake for this part because he needed to attain his dream. The girl then asked him his reasons for becoming a hero. Izuku answered that he wanted to make his loved ones proud. He noticed her Kansai accent and mentally registered that he had not encountered it before. When the lights dimmed, they fell silent as Present Mike took the stage and explained the rules of the practical examination for students from across Japan. He described the appearance of the training robots and their point values, with larger robots worth more points. Izuku realized he could not deliver the powerful blows necessary to break the third-tier robot's armor, so he would have to think smarter to defeat them. He began to consider different strategies and muttered ideas under his breath. The girl next to him watched him with a worried expression and a sharp intake of breath as she observed his thinking pose. As Izuku stroked his chin, working out how to handle the higher-value robots, he was pulled from his reverie by a new voice calling out to him. A nearby examinee called out indignantly to Izuku, pointing at his unkempt hair and complaining that his muttering was distracting everyone. Izuku, embarrassed, pointed at himself and stammered an apology, promising to try to be quieter. Present Mike stepped into the conversation and told the other examinee, identified as examinee 7111, that there was no reason to call Izuku out. Present Mike explained that Izuku had simply been making plans for taking on the robots and reminded them all of the last robot's gimmick. It was meant to be avoided rather than fought, like a thwomp from a platforming game. He closed by telling them that winning was about outwitting an opponent rather than defeating them outright, and wished the students luck before leaving. Izuku stretched as he prepared for the practical. He calculated in his head that the range of points required to get into U, based on previous years, was around 35, so aiming for 40 would secure a place in the heroics course. His plan was to defeat as many one-point robots as possible, but he knew he would need a few higher-value targets to prove he could handle larger threats. Present Mike returned to the platform as the gates began to open. Izuku seized the moment and slipped inside the training area before the pro hero could finish addressing the crowd. As he dashed past the doors, he caught the mirthful expression of Present Mike, whose smile widened and then moved on. A moment later Present Mike shouted that the exam had started, and when the other students hesitated, he scolded them for waiting. They rushed into the beta city at his prompt. Izuku cut through the simulated streets, taking down several one-point robots as they rounded corners. He discovered the power switches on the backs of the units and conserved energy by turning them off instead of destroying them. Within a minute he had accumulated 6 points. He continued moving quickly, disabling robots and keeping track of his score. When a 2-point robot opened fire with a Gatling-like weapon, Izuku used the smoke and distraction to rush its back and press the power button. He mentally tallied 9 points and reminded himself he needed 31 more to be accepted to UA. Over the next 8 minutes he darted through alleys and plazas, disabling 1-point models and occasionally stopping a more aggressive unit before it could harm another examinee. Some peers thanked him, others accused him of stealing a kill, but his point total steadily climbed. A few well-timed moves against higher-value robots brought him to 32 points. He was now only 3 points shy of his goal and felt a surge of optimism. Turning onto the main street of the beta city, he found that many of the other students had already taken down the nearby robots. He shifted his focus to keeping his peers from overextending themselves against the trickier units and continued the trial. Soon enough, the 0-pointer appeared, towering over the city at around 9 stories tall. Izuku worked to keep everyone out of its path, but while scanning for stragglers he heard a feminine cry for help. He saw students running without stopping to help and hurried toward the source. A girl lay pinned under rubble, apparently injuring her left leg. Izuku told her not to worry and that he would lift the rubble so she could get out, and she responded with a grunt. He hauled with everything he had and managed to free her. After she crawled out, he slung her onto his back and ran, watching the giant robot close in faster than he could. He heaved the girl clear just as the robot reached down to strike. Izuku crossed his arms in an X to shield her, bracing for impact, when a loud voice announced that time was up and instructed everyone to head home and rest before the results were sent, ending with the familiar catchphrase. Izuku dropped to his knees and let out the breath he had been holding. His whole body trembled as he tried to calm his racing heart. Once his breathing eased, he sat down beside the girl he had saved. They sat in silence for a moment, each thinking about their exam results for the heroics course. The girl thanked him for saving her. Izuku introduced himself as Midoriya Izuku. The girl introduced herself as Uraraka Ochako and asked what his score had been. Izuku said he had around 32 points before stopping to help and handle other robots, and Uraraka said she believed she had about 37. When Uraraka asked about his quirk, Izuku, feeling sad, explained that he was quirkless and had only managed to disable or pit robots against each other, hoping that would earn him points. Uraraka encouraged him, saying that a quirkless hero would show that heroes could be ordinary people too. Uraraka asked for Izuku's number so she could have a friend in Mizutafu since she was new, and Izuku blushed a little before giving it to her. Recovery Girl then appeared and applied a quick, professional healing technique to Uraraka before treating Izuku's minor injuries from the other contestants' robots. After they left, the brown-haired girl later went online to look up what being quirkless meant. She discovered a dangerous statistic about quirkless people. The situation. Izuku chuckled and reflected that she sounded like someone he would have loved as a mentor, someone whose advice he could have used through most of his school life. The older man expressed confidence that whatever Izuku's dreams were, he could attain them. Izuku asked the man's name, and the man introduced himself as Yagi Toshinori, expressing a sincere hope to see Izuku grow as a person before walking away. After showering, Izuku fed his son, Hyoriku, breakfast and left him in the care of Mitsuki Bakugo. Mitsuki smiled as he departed, and Izuku made his way toward UA, thinking over everything in his life up to that point. He had fallen in love with someone who had liked him for who he was despite his quirkless status. After her death he had made a new friend, and before she died they had had a child whom he was now raising alone. Now he had to prepare for the biggest test of his life. He looked at his phone's cracked screen, where a photo of his late girlfriend appeared. Her family had moved away from Mizutofu and contact had ceased. He shook his head and walked toward the large H building where students trained to become the best heroes they could be. Inside a small room on the right, Izuku began the written exam and focused on the ultimate test. He understood there were different types of heroes, and he believed he would be a Type 2 hero, someone who relied on intelligence gathering and smarter tactics rather than brute force. He spent nearly 2 hours in the testing room and emerged mentally exhausted. He had not expected the written portion to be so difficult, but he felt he had passed. The question that had tripped him up asked why heroism had become a profession in the age of quirks and superheroes and how it had come to be. He had been out of school for that portion of the curriculum and had been stumped. He sat alone in the auditorium and decided to rest before the proctor arrived. After about 50 minutes he was nudged awake by someone. A young girl with short brown hair, a permanent blush to her cheeks, and calm chocolate-brown eyes looked at him with concern. She asked if he was all right and mentioned that Present Mike was about to begin the practical portion information session. Izuku mumbled that his son had kept him up all night and wiped his eyes. The girl apologized for waking him and spoke quietly that she had not realized he was catching up on sleep. Izuku said he needed to be awake for this part because he needed to attain his dream. The girl then asked him his reasons for becoming a hero. Izuku answered that he wanted to make his loved ones proud. He noticed her Kansai accent and mentally registered that he had not encountered it before. When the lights dimmed, they fell silent as Present Mike took the stage and explained the rules of the practical examination for students from across Japan. He described the appearance of the training robots and their point values, with larger robots worth more points. Izuku realized he could not deliver the powerful blows necessary to break the third-tier robot's armor, so he would have to think smarter to defeat them. He began to consider different strategies and muttered ideas under his breath. The girl next to him watched him with a worried expression and a sharp intake of breath as she observed his thinking pose. As Izuku stroked his chin, working out how to handle the higher-value robots, he was pulled from his reverie by a new voice calling out to him. A nearby examinee called out indignantly to Izuku, pointing at his unkempt hair and complaining that his muttering was distracting everyone. Izuku, embarrassed, pointed at himself and stammered an apology, promising to try to be quieter. Present Mike stepped into the conversation and told the other examinee, identified as examinee 7111, that there was no reason to call Izuku out. Present Mike explained that Izuku had simply been making plans for taking on the robots and reminded them all of the last robot's gimmick. It was meant to be avoided rather than fought, like a thwomp from a platforming game. He closed by telling them that winning was about outwitting an opponent rather than defeating them outright, and wished the students luck before leaving. Izuku stretched as he prepared for the practical. He calculated in his head that the range of points required to get into U, based on previous years, was around 35, so aiming for 40 would secure a place in the heroics course. His plan was to defeat as many one-point robots as possible, but he knew he would need a few higher-value targets to prove he could handle larger threats. Present Mike returned to the platform as the gates began to open. Izuku seized the moment and slipped inside the training area before the pro hero could finish addressing the crowd. As he dashed past the doors, he caught the mirthful expression of Present Mike, whose smile widened and then moved on. A moment later Present Mike shouted that the exam had started, and when the other students hesitated, he scolded them for waiting. They rushed into the beta city at his prompt. Izuku cut through the simulated streets, taking down several one-point robots as they rounded corners. He discovered the power switches on the backs of the units and conserved energy by turning them off instead of destroying them. Within a minute he had accumulated 6 points. He continued moving quickly, disabling robots and keeping track of his score. When a 2-point robot opened fire with a Gatling-like weapon, Izuku used the smoke and distraction to rush its back and pressed the power button. He mentally tallied 9 points and reminded himself he needed 31 more to be accepted to UA. Over the next 8 minutes he darted through alleys and plazas, disabling one-point models and occasionally stopping a more aggressive unit before it could harm another examinee. Some peers thanked him, others accused him of stealing a kill, but his point total steadily climbed. A few well-timed moves against higher-value robots brought him to 32 points. He was now only 3 points shy of his goal and felt a surge of optimism. Turning onto the main street of the Beta City, he found that many of the other students had already taken down the nearby robots. He shifted his focus to keeping his peers from overextending themselves against the trickier units and continued the trial. Soon enough, the zero-pointer appeared, towering over the city at around 9 stories tall. Izuku worked to keep everyone out of its path, but while scanning for stragglers he heard a feminine cry for help. He saw students running without stopping to help and hurried toward the source. A girl lay pinned under rubble, apparently injuring her left leg. Izuku told her not to worry and that he would lift the rubble so she could get out, and she responded with a grunt. He hauled with everything he had and managed to free her. After she crawled out, he slung her onto his back and ran, watching the giant robot close in faster than he could. He heaved the girl clear just as the robot reached down to strike. Izuku crossed his arms in an X to shield her, bracing for impact, when a loud voice announced that time was up and instructed everyone to head home and rest before the results were sent, ending with the familiar catchphrase. Izuku dropped to his knees and let out the breath he had been holding. His whole body trembled as he tried to calm his racing heart. Once his breathing eased, he sat down beside the girl he had saved. They sat in silence for a moment, each thinking about their exam results for the heroics course. The girl thanked him for saving her. Izuku introduced himself as Midoriya Izuku. The girl introduced herself as Uraraka Ochako and asked what his score had been. Izuku said he had around 32 points before stopping to help and handle other robots, and Uraraka said she believed she had about 37. When Uraraka asked about his quirk, Izuku, feeling sad, explained that he was quirkless and had only managed to disable or pit robots against each other, hoping that would earn him points. Uraraka encouraged him, saying that a quirkless hero would show that heroes could be ordinary people too. Uraraka asked for Izuku's number so she could have a friend in Mizutafu since she was new, and Izuku blushed a little before giving it to her. Recovery Girl then appeared and applied a quick, professional healing technique to Uraraka before treating Izuku's minor injuries from the other contestants' robots. After they left, the brown-haired girl later went online to look up what being quirkless meant. She discovered a dangerous statistic about quirkless people: